we're going to all have to get much more comfortable with learning. And learning, let's face it, learning means not knowing. Like it or not, I'm going to be in a position as an individual of continuously learning, but also as a member of a team. We're going to be continuously learning. As an organization, we're going to be continuously learning. Now, that sounds sort of good, but that means continuously sort of reinventing ourselves at all three of those levels. And that's a crazy ride.
And if you don't have a culture where you try to learn from mistakes and where you accept that mistakes are made, you're going to have less innovation. Because you're going to take less risks. And ultimately, controlled risks is what gets you innovation, and that ultimately means that as a business you outperform others.
Hi everyone, welcome to another podcast of Ready to Transform. Today's episode is Creating Fearless Organizations in the Age of AI. My name is Robert Newland. I am the head of growth and an investor at Pandatrion, and I'm here with my collaborator, the amazing Lauri Paloheimo. As always, Lauri, guiding us through these journeys.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. And I want to introduce, our two guests, beginning with Amy Edmondson. Huge fan, as she knows, I already call myself an Amy groupie. She's an Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. As I like to say it when I talk about Amy almost on a weekly basis, she made the concept of psychological safety known across the planet thanks to her best-selling book, The Fearless Organization, and Not Right, Kind of Wrong. So she's an expert at creating conditions for innovation, learning, and growth in complex environments. And she does a lot of consulting and public speaking. And we're so thrilled to have you here, Amy.
Thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. And Caspar Herzberg, he's the president of AVEVA with 25 years of global tech leadership experience. Some of you may or may not know, but AVEVA is sort of like the consulting arm of a very large company called Schneider Electric, with 150,000 employees. Is it, Caspar? More or less?
Yes, Schneider has 160,000 employees, and AVEVA is an industrial software company that is owned by Schneider.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you basically took an internal competency and turned it into something that you can give other organizations across the planet. And fairly large organization. I mean, your staff, we're talking about how many people overall?
AVEVA has 10,000 employees, and I think 90% of Fortune 500 companies work with AVEVA in their industrial space.
Wow, impressive.
So everybody does, yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of AVEVAs out there on the planet, I guess. So obviously, combining sort of your technical expertise and implementation of AI with, Amy's knowledge and research around psychological safety is just a great combination to address how do we take the fear away in organizations in the age of AI, which is, the common thread and discussion in all these organizations. And so, let me begin with you, Caspar, maybe to kind of level set. What are you seeing enterprises across multiple sectors that they're doing to adopt AI? Where are they on their journey? Are they like early adopters that we're like somewhere further along in the adoption curve? What is going on?
So I think there's really two things to say on that. The first one is when you look at how much enterprises, how much companies are actually spending on AI, it's I think it's about 0.1% of sales, so very, very little. And if you compare that, of course, to the investment that is going into AI, there's a massive disconnect. At the same time, the second thing to say is that the industrial world especially has been working with AI for probably more than 20 years with predictive analytics, with looking at time series data, so the data that comes from machines, and using that to forecast and to anticipate shutdowns and other things. And that is fairly well established and used, and in combination with Gen AI, augmented AI, a very powerful tool. Right? So there we see a lot of, not just interest, but a lot of companies using it. But as an overall spend, it's very low. So we're at the very beginning.
So let me ask you a follow-up question, and then I'm going to go to Amy. You've seen both, sort of early adopters and more mature users of AI. Any traits that you think that may differentiate them based on your experience? Maybe a
So
mindset thing, maybe a budget thing, an operational thing.
absolutely. So industries, interestingly enough, it's industries like oil and gas
Yeah.
and other heavy industries that are quite advanced in the use of especially
Mm.
industrial AI. So they have generally a good view, a good hold on their data, which is a key component, and they use it well. Other At the other extreme, I would say there are other industries like let's
You're
say the
not gonna name industries, okay?
well, I mean,
Industry.
by their own admission, the marine industry, so ships, transport, right, that are very very much behind when it comes not just to the adoption of AI, but to the adoption of digital in general, right? So, and I think most other industries are somewhere in the middle. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And Amy, you know, you talked about organizations being sort of living adaptive, systems rather than just mechanical structures. How does this perspective may change when we're approaching AI implementation compared to sort of the traditional world of change management and adaptive organizations? It's a whole new world, right? I mean, you were at Davos, we were there, and we're talking about, for example, instead of the chief HR officer, now it's a chief resource officers determining whether I'm going to use a human resource or an AI resource. It's a big change.
It's a big change, but I think it actually intensifies the metaphor of organizations as complex adaptive
Mhm.
systems, or at least the description, right? It doesn't dial it back, it dials it up because it introduces a, a new set of variables, really, that need to be understood, that have profound systemic effects. Right? That you, in fact, you cannot talk about AI in isolation. You can, but I wouldn't recommend it. You need to talk about how it's affecting, as you said, the human resource function, or the logistics function, or any other aspect. It makes organizations that much more interdependent, complex, and to a certain extent unpredictable. Right. So we need to approach the whole idea with humility, I think.
So because what you're saying is basically, there were adaptive systems. Now they need to adapt more and faster with
More and
more components.
faster, and likely, I mean, the idea of thinking of organizations as complex adaptive systems is to embrace the humility you need to know that you cannot control them. They are not machines, right?
Fair.
They're systems. They're almost like organic systems that where the relationships between parts are more predictive of outcomes than the parts themselves. And now we're adding a powerful and fast moving new part. So the very idea becomes that much more true.
Right. And yeah, because I would argue that AI has been around, but then with Gen AI, there's this acceleration, right? And so as a follow up to you, then, when we talk about psychological safety, which is such a big important thing in organizations, how does that change really with Gen AI? Because it seems to be more personal to each worker, whereas before it felt like a more abstract structure thing,
Huh.
right?
Well, I mean, psychological safety briefly describes a learning environment, an environment where people believe that particularly the interpersonal risks of learning are acceptable, are welcome. And so I think given the increase in the learning needs that Gen AI and other factors bring, it means we're going to all have to get much more comfortable with learning. And learning, let's face it, learning means not knowing. Learning means I have to admit and understand and accept that I don't have a perfect plan. I don't have the solution. I don't have some kind of expertise that will just serve me well for the rest of my career. Like it or not, I'm going to be in a position as an individual of continuously learning, but also as a member of a team, we're going to be continuously learning. As an organization, we're going to be continuously learning. Now, that sounds sort of good, but that means continuously sort of reinventing ourselves at all three of those levels. And that's a crazy ride.
Yeah, and Lottie, I
Mhm.
wanted to interject. I mean, not only are you sort of our master builder of our content experience at Pandatron in the AI coaching platform. But you also see a lot of the anonymized dialogues that happen, right? And when you see our insights reports, there's a strong correlation around psychological safety that we see being reported by the users. Um, can you break that down for us, Lottie, in terms of what you're seeing from actual users engaged in AI coaching conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is interesting with AI coaching is that usually people approach it first with some kind of skepticism and curiosity, but eventually it forms into establishing a relationship because people are being met and listened and treated usually in a way that they have never before, unless you are an executive who has had the privilege to enjoy executive coaching, for example. For many people, just some kind of an entity being there and holding you space and really trying to understand you on your own terms and asking questions, that's really meaningful. And I've been trying to think that what exactly is psychological safety. And I kind of think that, fundamentally it's about the question that are you contracted or are you expanded? Because if you are contracted, which means that you are closing off, you are minimizing losses, you are minimizing the amount of uncertainty around you, you are not really in a form of learning, you are just avoiding pain. But once you get into the psychological safety, you move into, even on the level of your body, into a form of expansion. You start thinking about new types of gains that can be reached, and that happens by you feeling safe and allowing openness to the situation. And how would I say? It's a bit tragic that we need to use AIs for this, but we have to, because it's not part of the status quo. Because, the status quo is that people are scared for real that someone figures out that they might not have a complete sense of control over their workflow. It's a theater, it's a facade, and the data is out there. Your project Aristotle also proved the point very, very well. And then the question kind of is that how do we, in a sense, quit the theater so we actually, can start making meaningful gains and really start learning.
I just have to jump in because that Lonnie captured it so well. You can think of psychological safety as a dramatic reduction in that fear that nearly all adults have of being found out, right? Of being found out as not perfect, as not in control, as not knowing all the answers. And because of that fear, we will always hold back rather than lean in when in doubt, right? And that doubt is ever present unless we we actually actively do things. I don't mean as individuals, but as organizations, to lower that fear, right? And so for me, that was really quite an aha moment to hear Lonnie describe that, because the coaching conversations are by definition leading with inquiry, which is of course the very skill that I have for years been trying to imbue in managers at all levels, saying you've got to master the art of asking good questions, because good questions actually create psychological safety, because you are implying that you really want to know, you really want to hear what others say. And so that's sort of how you de facto create psychological safety. And now you're saying, okay, but what does it mean? What does it mean when it's being done with a AI partner, not a real partner? So over to you.
Yeah. Well, if I may, let me bring Caspar back to the
Yeah.
conversation. But I will first say that I got him up with Pandatron with tremendous skepticism, because I manage coaches, I assess leaders, and I was like, what is this thing going to do? But what I've seen from Lottie's work and the team's work is that AI coaching can provide a highly psychologically safe space where you don't feel judged, and you can talk about your fears and concerns, which you can do with your leader. Because if you may do that and you say, I'm afraid of this change in AI, your leader may label you as, he's not in it to win it, right? He's the loser we want out. And maybe you
Mm,
just need to
mm.
navigate through that. But then I want to zoom out and go look at the whole forest and not at the individual. And Caspar, I guess I want to ask you, we hear a lot, with McKinsey all the time, 70% of transformation projects fail. But the other telling statistic that we heard at the World Economic Forum is that about 60% of transformation initiatives don't even begin because of fear of failure. So then I want to ask you, based on your vast experience of, what initiatives are you actually seeing out there from the perspective of AI and Gen AI that organizations are actually sort of invested in doing, and which ones you feel maybe they should be doing that they aren't, perhaps because of that fear of failure? So I'm not even going to call it individual psychological safety, but almost organizational psychological safety, right?
I think so. I think it's the question to answer, right? And I think it starts with accepting that this is a problem, which I don't think everyone does. Not every manager, every leader does.
Absolutely.
And I think once you accept that an organization that is primarily driven by fear is going to underperform other organizations that aren't like that, right? And I think there's a lot of not just studies but practical experiences that will drive you to that conclusion. When you accept that if people are uncomfortable to say that I've done something wrong and now I'm going to do it better, and if you don't have a culture where you try to learn from mistakes and where you accept that mistakes are made, right, then you're going to be less, you're going to have less innovation. Because you're going to take less risks. And ultimately, controlled risks is what gets you innovation, and that ultimately means that as a business you outperform others.
Mm.
That'd be the first thing to say, right? So you have to know that this is a problem. The second thing is then you as a leader, what do you do about it, right? And there's a saying in German where I'm from that a fish stinks from the head. So that means that you have to be quite transparent also when things aren't going well about yourself, about your role in it. You have to ask, as Amy said, the questions that show that you care. You have to take an interest in the workforce, and you have to make sure that this is somehow replicated at, especially if you run a very large organization, at the levels. At the subsequent levels in the organization. And there, of course, not just AI, but digital tools are very useful because you can kind of turn that into a system
Mm.
where people in the system um, operate in this way. The way that you ask questions, the way that you don't punish for failures, and the way where you make people realize that this fear that drives people into silos, because I mean silos is a very natural thing. People like to build walls, right? Because it keeps the wolves out, right? But ultimately that's generally not good for business, right? And it's also not good for the adoption of AI or of transformational initiatives. So how can you get your workforce to take down its barriers, right? Its walls, and work with others, and then of course not punish them for it by then taking a lot of cost out as a result. So that's
Yeah.
also the truth, right?
Oh, Amy, and we're gonna talk about that with you a little bit later. About making mistakes that they're okay to make.
Well,
If
and
that's
I
the conversation.
okay. I'll wait on that then.
I know, because I saw you like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
jumping out the bit for that. We have a whole
Yeah.
section just on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more with what
Yeah,
Casper
Casper
just
just
said.
framed it,
Yeah.
perfectly, and is really, really, important. Uh, but I do want to ask you, Amy, another question, which, when we talk about psychological safety, as we go into this role of AI, um, are you seeing a shift in sort of the unmet human needs for psychological safety now that we're sort of accelerating with AI? Or you're like, it's sort of the same problems, just sort of
No.
in a different environment. I'm curious to know what you're seeing.
Somewhere in between, right? So it's sort of the same problem in a different environment, and that same problem, I think, is magnified or intensified, both in its importance and in its, magnitude.
Okay. And are you seeing maybe perhaps an accelerated or maybe an augmented and then resistance in
Yeah.
barriers because of that? Or is it,
Yes.
so in other words, as the resistance increase, or is it the same, right?
I have to say, I don't have systematic data to answer that question, right? So
I
this would be
got you.
very casual.
Or more
But,
anecdotal than that you hear
but
from,
but I think very casually people are resisting, and they always have since the
Mm.
beginning of time. Right? They are resisting change because change will almost always be interpreted as a threat, unless it's sort of very obviously, look here, I'm going to make your life better. And this in particular, AI is often or widely being interpreted as a threat because the association between AI and job loss has been very widely made and understood. It's whether,
some of
I
it
don't
is
think
real,
we
some of it
know.
is hyped by the media that they would love to, like, you know, get a lot of clickbait for to sell ads, because some of it is true, some of it may be actually. Um, I think it's fascinating the sort of the information that we get somewhere in between the truth lies, right? Um,
Right.
but when it comes to fear, my last follow up to you, I guess, can you help the audience sort of distinguish what would be the difference between, let's call it, healthy skepticism versus what is actually harmful resistance, right?
Right. Well, actually, I think it's really well put in a way. The answer is embedded in the question, right? That it's
Mm.
really important to help people make that distinction. So I have long distinguished between unproductive fear and productive fear, and it is of course productive to be afraid of the virus. It's productive to be afraid of the competitors who may be moving faster than you. It's productive to be afraid of what happens if we don't innovate. Right? Those are real fears, and I think one of the things that makes them productive is that they're discussable, right? We can talk about that. There's nothing shameful in sort of saying, "Gee, I'm worried about that competitor out there," or we could get sick if we do, are exposed to that virus. Like that's all very discussable. The unproductive kinds of fear in organizations are the fears of each other, right? That the fear of being found out, right? That is just profoundly unproductive because it leads people to hold back. It leads people to engage in behaviors that are the opposite of the ones that are needed for
Right.
them and their teams and organizations to learn and grow.
Okay,
Mhm.
and Caspar, I want to ask you, and then I want to ask you, Lauri, to kind of bring it together from the perspective of Pandatron's experience doing systemic AI coaching.
Mhm.
But you do a lot of implementations around digital transformation, and with AI, probably there's, so that which Amy's talking about, you're seeing it real life, right? So uh, have you seen, can you tell us some of the sort of healthy skepticism that you see in this project implementations, and some of what you would say these are actually not productive or harmful, and obviously not naming names, but generally speaking, can you tell the audience how would you say, okay, this is beneficial and this is really not great when it comes to having skepticism or fear in these projects, these major transformations for organizations?
So again, the way I would approach this is first by acknowledging that for a number of reasons that we've just discussed, right, there is skepticism, especially in the workforce, as to in the wider workforce, that AI may lead to their job going away. Now, there's a lot of studies that actually AI is going to drive more jobs over time rather than less, because we will know more, and as a result, there'll be more to do to make it really simple. But of course, it's also true that there are probably some job groups, especially those that have to do with repetitive tasks, yeah, that are going to see probably a significant reduction. And as a result, the big challenge then is less that there'll be less jobs and more that there'll be a lot of retraining needed of the workforce for the new type of jobs. And retraining is super difficult. Now you can use AI to retrain, and that might be easier, not for real, right? I mean that is probably something that is not enough
Emphasized.
emphasized or understood yet, right? But it doesn't take, it doesn't mean that people aren't worried about that. Now that's the first thing. The second thing is, while the technology does work well, AI is only as good as the data that you input. I mean, we all know that. But if you, as an organization, haven't got control of your data, then a lot of the output that the algorithm produces is not necessarily that trustworthy. And what might work in the, let's say, the social media space, right, certainly doesn't work in the world of machines, where the output has to be 100% correct every time, right? So that is, again, healthy skepticism until you get your data right.
Right.
That's how I would break it down between the two, right? One is more on the human side, and the other one is more an organizational effort that is quite difficult to do, because people in silos produce a lot of data, right? That is then siloed data, and then to bring all of that together is quite hard, and is ultimately more a management and process question than it is a human question or a technical question.
Right. And perhaps part of what you're seeing, Caspar, is, people are sullied by transformations, that, people are like, you maybe get to middle management and that's all. After that, it's just one-way communication to everybody else. And there's already a level of skepticism with transformations. And they're saying, well, I'm just going to wait for this leader to leave and not really finish your transformation, get the next leader. But now with Gen AI, it seems to hit more personal. And so, it before you had a transformation and it seemed to be something sort of structural. Now with Gen AI, it seems to be a lot more personal. And then I want to go to you, Lauri, because I know when I look at the Pandatrion Insight reports from our customers, I see that there are a lot of trending topics around psychological safety, around employee well-being, stress, and I'm kind of sort of lead the witness here with what are you seeing, but I also, to share with the audience and with you guys, what I also see is that sometimes when they're interacting, with the Panda AI coach, we begin to see trending negative to trending positive to provide a space to reflect on these fears. Can you share a little bit more about how that dynamic happens in the structures you put together, and what you're seeing from users in terms of the benefit from some to sort of navigating through these fears that they have?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think here we kind of need to go a little bit into the change philosophy behind, like how we do things. Where I think the first principle is that I always use when designing the sessions is called respecting the resistance. Starting from the assumption that people are not they're not stupid. They are there. They have resistance because it comes from serving some kind of interest. It comes from having some kind of a benefit. It might be exaggerated, it might be a misguided, but still it comes from some kind of a positive value that is expressed. And the more we talk about resistance as in terms of something that we need to remove, that is patronizing and condescending, and quite frankly leads just to more resistance. So we in a sense need to understand that. And the coaching basically starts from the standpoint of inquiring into what are the benefits of this kind of resistance? What are you avoiding with this? What is this protecting you from? And then after that, you can go more gradual into trying to understand that what is the process resistance? Like, do they, for example, feel that they cannot learn this or do they feel that because there have been previous technological changes that eventually, were hyperbolic and nothing really changed, so they don't need to take this one seriously. And then there's another dimension, which is outcome resistance, which is, for example, if I, start giving too much data to these AIs, will I lose my job? I'm not telling, my coworker about how to do things. Why the heck should I tell that to machine? Like, that might just wipe out the whole department. So how would I say? That's why I think using AI for coaching is really it's quite clever, because it provides this certain kind of safety into understanding people on their own terms, understanding what is the image of the organization that no one talks about but everyone thinks about, And they might not even be aware of that until they start articulating that to the AI. So this then leads to this, how would I say, I think a process where uncertainty, instead of being a form of anxiety, eventually becomes even like some kind of a form of enjoyment, which then loops back to this what you have written, Amy, about learning. That
Yeah.
People start valuing uncertainty, they start valuing experimentation, they start understanding that keeping things as they are has sunk costs. Not trying new things has opportunity costs, and therefore, again, like instead of
Right.
being contracted, they expand themselves to new options, to new opportunities, to new selves, to new career tracks, which is precisely, I think that's even more important than reskilling and upskilling, because reskilling and upskilling presupposes these existing categories
That is
of
so true.
what we are supposed to do.
Yeah.
No, that's secondary, because no one knows what we are supposed to do
Right.
except the people themselves in their environments, working with their customers, understanding the nuance and the context of the value ecosystem that they're embedded in. That's why we do systemic AI coaching and not just AI coaching, because I do think that individualism as an organizational paradigm is going to wither away, because we have to understand that we are embedded in value networks where we have both humans and we have both AIs that are working in novel, uncertain environments where you kind of wing it and figure it out and try out new things. And that's why it's so important for organizations to understand that they need to create win-win narratives and even win-win incentives for people to feel safe. Because right now, everyone is afraid because they have the image and assumption that we are playing zero-sum games of musical chairs of who gets dropped out with the next budget cuts.
Well,
So
I'm,
yeah.
I'm glad you presented this, because actually my transitions comment to Envy was going to be how you focus on systemic coaching versus just one-to-one coaching. So you actually landed that plane perfectly for me. So thank you for that. And probably I was going to do that because I listened to you a lot, and I'm so glad that you do what you do for Pandatrion, because it's quite amazing. But Amy, talking about failing, right? You're talking about basic, complex, and intelligent failures. And can you talk a little about that, and also probably take a deeper dive on what is an intelligent failure, which is the kind that we want, and how do you think leaders enable that to happen in organizations?
Yeah, and I'll go back to something Caspar said, which was about mistakes, and they have to be okay. And I'll just say, and this is challenging because not every language has the same words for these concepts. But in English, a mistake is an unintended deviation from existing processes or rules or knowledge. And so that means at least there was the potential to get it right. Whereas a failure refers to an undesired outcome. So many failures are caused by mistakes, but not all failures are caused by mistakes. And many failures are, in fact, theoretically and practically preventable, but some failures are not. And those are the good kind, right? And those are, I call them intelligent failures, but they essentially have 4 attributes. They're in genuinely new territory, and we haven't been here before. So we have no choice but to try and in new territory and see what happens. They're in pursuit of a goal with a hypothesis, or another way to say that is you have good reason to believe it might work. You've done your homework. And number 4, it's no larger than necessary, right, to get the new knowledge that we badly need. And so those kinds of failures are going to have to become more prevalent and more beloved by all of us, right? And we can still adhere to the goal of trying to minimize the preventable failures. And those come, in my view, in 2 categories: the basic and the complex. The basic are those that are generally caused by a single mistake, often due to inattention or various other human failings that we all have, but we all seek to do better. And then the complex failures are multi-causal. They're the perfect storms. They're the breakdowns that happen when not one, but several deviations from best practice occur. Generally, any one of those factors on its own would not produce a failure, right? You dodge that bullet all the time, but the co-occurrence of factors leads to the breakdown, like a supply chain collapse in the middle of, we won't even go there. So my sort of ultimate premise with the book and some of this work is that it is the leader's job and the organization's job to help people clarify the difference, right? So that they are willing and understand that it is admirable to engage in thoughtful experiments that nonetheless fail, whereas it's not admirable to kind of be sloppy, right? To mail it in, to not do the training program that you need to do something well. So it's I think when we change our thinking, we sort of change our behaving and also lower the anxiety.
So Lottie landed the plane, you drove it through, the taxiway, and now Caspar, I'm gonna ask you to take it to the gate for us, if you will,
All
right?
right.
Just to
Yeah.
use the whole plane analogy, just because I flew in last night at 2 a.m.
So the
and
passengers can, disembark.
and the passengers are the leadership and employees that need to adopt AI fearlessly, right? So when you hear about this, and we hear about sort of AI replacing jobs and all this, how do you think that we can help organizations change the narrative as leaders so that they tell their employees and themselves, it's okay to have failures, so long as they're intelligent failures, and let's enable the failing so that we can move forward. How do you think we can do that in organizations you're working with?
So twofold. Yeah. One, and I come back to what we discussed earlier and what Amy just talked about, which is how do you show up as a leader? Do you talk about when you have failed? Do you talk about what you have learned from those failures? I mean, myself, now a fairly long time ago, worked in Cisco, and I developed a blueprint for smart cities in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. And I had a lot of support from the leadership, from the then chairman, John Chambers. And it completely bombed, meaning it failed. And I had to take ownership for it. And they didn't fire me. They gave me another chance. And I was then successful in other markets with the same concept, having learned from what I did there. And I think telling these type of stories to your team, to the overall organization quite publicly, I think creates the climate where there is more trust and more willingness to adopt new ways of working, which ultimately AI is, right? Secondly, it has AI is a transformation, and ultimately you're doing it for a reason, and that reason you have to be very, very clear about, right?
So
I mean, in the end, at the moment, everyone wants to adopt AI, but for what? In the end, there are problems you have, right, as a company. Either it is competition, you want to grow, whatever it is, you want to reduce waste. There are good reasons why you do something, and being very clear about what those reasons are, and then why the new technology, the combination of technologies, the combination of maybe different leaders with those technology is going to be good to achieve this outcome. Telling that story and not making it a one-way communication, as you've laid out earlier, I think is very, very important. So, these two.
Thank you. And Amy, I want to go back to you, but I also want to say that failing forward to success, you did write a book, Smart Cities, Digital Nations, probably as a result of that kind of work too. So something wonderful did come out of that, and from all that learning, Caspar.
Yep.
Um, you see, we learn, from every experience.
Yeah.
So I'm sure a
Yeah.
lot of people benefited from your experience and reading that book. So a shameless plug as well, but if you have something meaningful to share, might as well let everybody know that is out there as well. So Amy, in your research, you say that traditional hierarchies can inhibit fluid collaboration needed for innovation, right? And this is, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit, when it comes to systemic AI coaching, and just for the audience, you're one of our content partners and collaborators, and we're thrilled to have you. And I, as I told you before we started this, if you're, ears are ringing, I mentioned your name about 6, 7 times a week when I tell everybody that working one of our exercises based on your body of work helped me tremendously in being a better leader. So I'm kind of leading the witness here, right? But so when you talk about this hierarchies, how do you think AI coaching can maybe help organization sort of transcend this traditional structures,
Yeah.
of thinking?
I do want to say, to be clear, hierarchy is a risk factor because of human psychology. That fear we talked about earlier of being found out is more acute in a status hierarchy of any kind, right? Simply because that other person's opinion of you might have a larger impact on your future, right? So this is, humans are very skillful sense makers, and we make sense of hierarchical, situations very quickly. So that's something. It's I think when you understand that's a risk factor, then you can do the things you need to do to mitigate the risk. And so I've never been sort of the mind that we have to drive hierarchy out of our social systems. You cannot, or in most cases you cannot. But when those with higher status or power,
So you're
or
not suggesting anarchy.
yeah, I'm not saying anarchy, and I'm not even saying like some hypothetical flat everything, right? But
Functional hierarchy,
but,
maybe.
but yeah, even so, I mean, even expertise hierarchies. But when those who are, let's just say, for simplicity, higher in a hierarchy are aware that their position could have a silencing effect on others, then they are also aware that that's going to hurt them. But so then they go out of their way to do the things they need to do, like skillful inquiry, like deep listening, like reinforcing and rewarding the ideas that people have, or and anyway. So yes, I think just one of the great things about the AI coaching is that it bypasses hierarchy, right? So long as you don't think hierarchy is sort of listening in some way, but it bypasses it. And
Yeah.
by definition, you are in a situation where there is not a person judging you. And I think most people are fairly comfortable that the technology isn't judging them either. So they feel more able to share honestly, and therefore they feel more able to learn. So they are more able to learn, and that's ultimately what it's all about.
Yeah. And Caspar, can you, in your experience, which I know is quite extensive, have you been able to, and I'm not asking you to do the research on this, but sort of anecdotally and your observations, sort of see perhaps a difference between organizations that are successful in implementing new digital frameworks, even along AI, and the ones that are not, a mega correlation between hierarchies that are more constraining what you're able to do versus the ones that actually are enabling you to function better? Is there using a correlation there?
So I think there is a correlation between strong and lived hierarchies and lower performance. I do think that. I do think that there's also a correlation between transformation initiatives of any kind being less successful in organizations um, that have very strong and very personally felt hierarchies. Right? Now, at the end, organizations don't work without leaders, right?
Right.
Um, and that, I think, is where culture comes in, and where if you try to instill a certain sense of humility in your leadership, a sense of listening, and also then a sense of being empowered to make decisions fast. Because the other problem with very hierarchical organization is that decisions are, because people are afraid at every level, often not taken or delayed, because ultimately only the ultimate decision maker can make the decision, if you like, right? And so delegating down is very important. And AI, whether as augmented AI, as decision support, is very useful if you are in an organization that delegates down, because the people that make decisions need access to more information because they need to know what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
In the end,
Exactly.
it's quite
Yeah.
quite simple, right? So I think there's a healthy reinforcing, you know, circle between what is there now from a technology point of view and distributed and delegated decision making. Interestingly enough, in a lot of companies, again, not naming any, very often AI is a, top-down thing. There's an AI team, there's an AI leader, and everybody now has to start
Mm.
AI. That's not really how these things work. In the end, the more people naturally adopt things. And I think that, for example, in the UK, I read that 57% of knowledge workers in the UK now use AI, whether it's provided by the company or not.
Yeah.
And 90-something% of them think it's very useful. So I think there's a lot of bottom-up use of especially augmented AI. And I think they work well with delegation, right? And the more you delegate, the more nimble you are, the more you will outperform.
Right.
The more experimentation,
The more experimentation,
there is.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think organizations that don't have proper governance and enablement of AI tools, you have way too much bring your AI to work, and there's been already news about sharing things into LLMs that are public that should not be there. So
Mm.
Also that
almost
is
like
a-
your employees are there, your company's
Yep.
governance may not be, but your
Yep.
employees are there. Now,
Yep.
Lauri, let me go to you, and I'm going to give you a new plane to land here.
Sure. Let's go.
Because I just thought of this, and when I'm hearing about traditional hierarchies, sort of inhibiting innovation. Let's we go to AI, and as Caspar is saying, what we need more bottom up. Help me envision a situation where you can do like the Panda AI coach to sort of do bottom up envisioning of innovation through AI that can perhaps break down those hierarchical silos, if you will, and create a more collaborative environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would start from deconstructing this idea that about change management, where we in a sense do see that there is point A and point B, and change management is where we move from point A to point B. But I kind of think that change management has a bit similar premise as breathing management, because change is like breathing. Change is just something that happens. It's you can consciously breathe. There's quite a lot of different techniques on how you can do it for different types of effects, but still, breathing is not something that you manage. So I think like understanding that how people are and how organizations, in a similar way as forests are not something to be managed, but they are instead something that to be nurtured, because they are an ecosystem of different kinds of agents that are kind of constantly trying to figure out what to do next and what not to do. There's the constant trial and error we call learning. So with AI coaching, I feel that people, instead of pretending that there is this artificial command and control and constraint of what am I supposed to do and what I'm not supposed to do, but instead they are allowed to imagine and to experiment systematically by figuring out what to do next and logging in the results, and then the AI sparring you that, okay, so what we did learn that doesn't work. That if you give that to everyone, and not just everyone as individuals, but everyone as a network, because people constantly, they talk, they emulate each other. That's something we saw, for example, with one of our first clients, which is a global construction company. Their management used our systemic AI coaching. What was interesting was that even though it wasn't part of the value proposition, the management started mimicry of the AI. They started coaching their own teammates because they found out that this way of leading is actually it gets people to think for themselves. It gets people to think about their particular context, the particular value that they are trying to produce, the particular problems that they have, which are not something for the managers to figure out, because usually they don't even know that well what's going on the shop floor.
But Lauri, let me please expand, but just for the audience to understand a little bit more where you're coming from, that's different. There is sort of AI coaching, coach me on whatever. And then there is sort of systemic coaching, which is what
Yeah.
you're talking about, which is here's a framework around a particular construct that we need to work on together. So it's a lot more intentional from a systems basis as opposed to
Yeah.
I have a particular need or desire to be coached on something, but it may be AI adoption, it may be cultural transformation. And I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like fundamentally, the systems perspective is about understanding interdependence, understanding that you are constantly influencing your teammates, your supervisor, your customers, and they are influencing you. And then understanding how do you want to influence them and how they are influencing you, in what ways they are influencing you that is constraining you, what would you need to ask from them so they could instead enable you. And if you do that, it has a ripple effect throughout the whole organization. And I think this is, especially in the Western world, what we need. I think, especially East Asian cultures are far ahead in this kind of thinking. And that is something that the global competition, demands, that we think with machines and we think with each other and we try out new things. So we figure out the best way to move forward and do it again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
Which is why, in a sense, we need to value learning and we need to enjoy uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're not going to succeed.
And so we're in, wow, supposed to be we're 15 minutes into this, and I know we can talk for 3 more hours because it's so exciting. The discussion, talking to you, it's quite a treat. But so let me just ask, one last question. Amy, I'm going to leave you for last, but I'm going to go to Caspar, first. When you think of AI, and I want to ask you to put on your organizational psychologist hat on.
Okay.
How do you think that we can use it to enhance rather than to sort of threaten the psychological safety of people? What advice would you give your customers when it comes to that, right?
So when I think about an example here, right? Imagine you're a new engineer, young, and you are now managing a wind farm, renewable energy with lots of turbines in several places, and you've not had a great handover because the previous engineer or the previous manager retired, and there weren't a lot of people to tell you what to do. Now, traditionally, you'd have to read yourself through hundreds of manuals of all the different machines, all the different components. You'd still then miss the experience of how they actually perform in different environments, different humidity. Are they by the sea? Are they in the water? Are they, near mountains, and so on? And what AI can do, augmented AI, is that it can actually give you, without the need to be that deeply technically proficient, advice on when our machine is going to break down. It the algorithm can predict the now with Gen AI. You can ask it questions. You can say, oh, can you just build me a table? Can you compare it to each other? What should I do? You can ask open-ended questions, and the response is going to be correct, provided the data that goes into it is correct. So that's a huge leap forward, really, as we have this big generational shift from one generation of engineers to another. A lot more people are retiring at the moment in industry than new people are joining, especially when it comes to managing remote assets. It's not very popular, right, to be in the desert near a mine or an offshore platform. So there, AI plays a huge role. And I think that's quite well understood and is going to be a very positive case study, if you like, for the adoption of augmented AI, in the workforce. So the more we tell these type of stories, the more people will want to work with it, and the more successful the implementations will be, frankly. Yeah.
Nice. And Amy, I think a lot of people are gonna want to hear from Amy answer this question, which is, I need to implement AI in my organization. What advice would she give in terms of making my workforce feel more psychologically safe? when it comes to AI? It's a big question,
Yeah.
every little
Well,
time, but an important one.
I mean, I'm going to say three things. And the first, maybe the most important, which is approach it explicitly, right? Be very open about this and say it again and again as a learning journey. We are embarking. I don't know if you want to land the plane or take off the plane, or you're on an ocean voyage, but you are going on a journey without a map, and therefore the frame is, I need you, right? We will team up and figure this out together. These experiments, and I love Caspar's description and the example, because it's the tacit knowledge that you used to only have access to if you were right there, physically present, sort of with, and because the tacit knowledge is both social and contextual, and it's not codified, right? And so, okay, so we're going on a journey together. It is a learning journey. To succeed on this voyage, we won't have passengers. We will only have crew members, right? So all hands on deck. We need you. And by the way, what will you be doing? You will be experimenting. Experiments will produce successes and failures, and we will learn from all of it. And then thirdly, and maybe obviously, but not to be taken for granted, respond productively. Do not get angry when the experiment fails. Right. But to celebrate the beeps going forward as well as the little successes going forward. And that, that will reinforce, that will talk about feedback loops, that will reinforce a kind of the learning environment you need to arrive somewhere. And we'll never arrive anywhere, but to make progress on the journey.
Nice. And Lottie, we're 56 minutes into this, so I'm gonna give you like 30 seconds to land that plane, right? From your vantage point, because I mean, we have sort of like a tech operator, major transformation projects. We have a top researcher and an author and thinker in the space of psychological safety. But then we have you that, I mean, you're quite something yourself, no doubt. And I have a lot of respect for you and the work you do. So if you were to explain to somebody, how can this systemic AI coaching framework help people and organizations deal with psychological safety, what would you say?
To put it poetically, I think it is that because it opens people to an exponential possibility. Because people don't understand that we have new technologies but old ways of thinking. And in order for us to actually benefit from the new technologies, we need to update to the new ways of thinking. What these new ways of thinking are not yet defined, because they are defined by thinking with the new technologies.
Very nice. Well said. So Lauri, co-founder and head of change and content of Pandatrion, and my partner in this podcast, Caspar, Amy, thank you so much. This has been quite the treat. Better than breakfast, better than lunch, although I'm hungry now for real food. But it's been great food for the soul and the mind. I really appreciate your time. I know your time is valuable, and you made it being here. A lot of people are going to benefit from this conversation. So thank you, everybody.
I learned a lot.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Wonderful.
it.
All right, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And thanks,
right,
everybody who's listening. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ready to Transform. If you enjoyed it, we've got more for you beyond the podcast. Join Pandatron's Learning Lab for early access to our newest AI coaching tracks, a chance to network with industry peers, and exclusive sessions with some of the world's top thought leaders. You'll find the details in the episode description. See you next time, and until then, be ready to transform.